Some dogs wait their whole lives for one command, even after the world forgets the man who gave it. Rain crawled down the narrow prison window in slow silver lines, turning the pale moonlight into something cold and ghost-like. Deep inside Blackwater State Penitentiary, where steel doors groaned like tired memories and fluorescent lights buzzed overhead without mercy, Ethan Cole sat alone in the final holding cell on death row. Tomorrow at 5:30 a.m., the state of Texas planned to end his life. 8 years earlier, Ethan had been one of Houston PD's most respected K-9 officers, a decorated Marine veteran, a man known for calm judgment and impossible loyalty. But tonight, none of that mattered. The orange prison uniform hung loose on his broad frame now, and the silver beginning to creep through his dark hair made him look older than 42. His rough hands rested quietly on the metal table bolted to the concrete floor, while a paper cup of untouched coffee cooled beside him. Outside the bars, distant footsteps echoed through the corridor. Slow, heavy, final. Ethan barely looked up when the guard stopped outside his cell. "You refusing the last meal too?" the older guard asked gently. Ethan nodded once. "Not hungry." The guard hesitated. Men on death row usually asked for something. Steak, pie, cigarettes, a prayer. But Ethan's eyes stayed fixed on the rain beyond the tiny glass window. "You still got one final request," the guard said after a moment. "Anything legal, the state tries to honor it." Silence lingered between them. Then Ethan finally spoke, his voice rough from years of swallowing grief. "I want to see my dog." The guard frowned slightly. "Your old K-9? Ethan nodded again. "Shadow." Just hearing the name seemed to pull the air from the room. For the first time all night, something moved behind Ethan's tired green eyes. Not fear, not anger, just ache, deep and quiet. The guard shifted awkwardly. "Cole, that dog's got to be, what, 12 years old now?" 13, Ethan whispered. "If he's still alive." Somewhere farther down the corridor, another steel door slammed shut. The sound rolled through the prison like thunder. Ethan closed his eyes for a second, and memory came flooding back anyway. Shadow sprinting across a dusty training field at sunrise. Shadow sleeping beside his bed after long shifts. Shadow pressing against his chest the night Ethan lost his wife to cancer 3 years before the arrest. The dog had stayed through everything. Until the day armed officers dragged Ethan from his own home in handcuffs while Shadow barked himself bloody against the patrol car window, trying to follow him. Ethan never saw him again after that. The guard cleared his throat softly. "I'll make the call," he muttered. "No promises." Ethan gave the faintest nod. The guard turned away, keys rattling at his hip, boots fading slowly down the corridor. Then silence returned. Heavy, endless. Ethan stared at the rain again, listening to the prison breathe around him. Somewhere beyond these concrete walls, beyond the razor wire and watchtowers, there had once been a German shepherd who would have crossed fire just to reach him. Ethan lowered his head into trembling hands. "Goodbye, partner," he whispered into the empty cell. But less than 20 minutes later, somewhere deep in the prison hallway, a dog bark shattered the silence. The bark came again. Deep, hoarse, old, yet unmistakable. Ethan's head lifted so fast the metal chair legs scraped sharply against the concrete floor. For one impossible second, the prison disappeared. The rain disappeared. The years disappeared. Only that sound remained. A sound that once echoed through training grounds at dawn and empty highways after midnight patrols. Ethan slowly stood, his pulse hammering against his ribs. Outside the cell, voices stirred down the corridor. Guards speaking low, confused. One muttered curse. Then came the soft clicking of claws against concrete. Slow at first, uneven, like age itself walking through the hallway. Ethan stepped toward the bars, gripping the cold steel so tightly his knuckles whitened. The overhead lights flickered faintly, washing the corridor in pale yellow shadows. Then he saw him. An old German shepherd emerged beside the prison chaplain near the far security gate. Gray dusted the dog's muzzle now. His sable coat no longer carried the sleek shine it once had. One ear tilted slightly lower than the other from an old injury during training years ago. But the eyes had not changed. Amber. Alert. Searching. Shadow stopped walking. The old dog stood perfectly still beneath the buzzing prison lights, as if his body no longer trusted miracles. Ethan felt his breath catch painfully in his chest. "Shadow," he whispered. The dog's ears twitched instantly. The chaplain loosened his grip on the leash. "Easy boy," he murmured softly. But Shadow was no longer listening to anyone else. Slowly, almost carefully, the German shepherd moved forward again. His paws clicked against the concrete like a heartbeat echoing through the corridor. Guards stepped aside without speaking. One younger officer quietly removed his hat. Another swallowed hard and looked away. Ethan could not move. He had survived Marine deployments overseas, buried friends, courtrooms, 8 years of death row, but nothing prepared him for this. Shadow reached the bars and stopped inches away. Up close, Ethan could see time written across him now. The stiffness in his back legs, the cloudy edges around his eyes, the faint scar beneath his collar where an old tactical harness once rested for years. Ethan slowly knelt on the concrete floor. "Hey, partner," he whispered, voice trembling apart. For a moment, Shadow simply stared at him. No bark, no movement. The prison hallway became so silent Ethan could hear rain tapping distant windows somewhere beyond the walls. Then Shadow lowered his head slightly and sniffed Ethan's trembling hand through the bars. One breath, then another. Suddenly the old dog let out a broken whine so full of recognition it shattered something inside every man standing there. Shadow pressed forward hard against the steel bars, tail trembling weakly as he pushed his muzzle desperately into Ethan's hands. Ethan closed his eyes instantly. Tears finally came after 8 years without them. "I know," he whispered over and over. "I know, buddy. I missed you too." Shadow whined again and licked Ethan's scarred hands frantically like he was trying to erase every lost year himself. The chaplain quietly wiped his eyes. Even the older guards turned away to give the man privacy. But then something changed. Shadow suddenly froze. The warmth vanished from his body in an instant. His ears lifted sharply toward the far end of the corridor. A low growl slowly vibrated deep in his chest. Ethan opened his eyes immediately. He knew that sound. It was not fear. It was warning. Down the hallway near the security checkpoint stood a tall man in a dark overcoat speaking quietly with the prison warden. Retired Captain Warren Grady, the same commanding officer who testified against Ethan 8 years earlier. Grady noticed the dog staring and forced a polite smile. "Still protective after all these years," he said casually. But Shadow did not wag his tail. The German shepherd stepped in front of Ethan's cell like a shield. His growl deepened. Every hair along his spine slowly rose beneath the fluorescent lights. Ethan's heartbeat slowed coldly inside his chest. Because Shadow only reacted like that around one kind of person, someone dangerous. The growl did not stop. It rolled low through the prison corridor like distant thunder before a storm. Every officer standing nearby felt it. Shadow's amber eyes never left Captain Warren Grady. Not once. The retired captain forced another uneasy smile, though the muscles near his jaw tightened slightly beneath the fluorescent lights. "Looks like the old dog still remembers police work," he said lightly. But nobody laughed. Ethan slowly rose from the floor beside the bars, his pulse steady now in the strange way it used to become before dangerous situations overseas. He had trusted Shadow with his life for nearly a decade. The dog had detected hidden narcotics inside engine blocks, located missing children in flood zones. Once even alerted Ethan to a hidden gas leak seconds before an explosion destroyed half a warehouse in Galveston. Shadow never reacted without reason. Never. The old German shepherd stepped away from Ethan's cell, positioning himself directly between Ethan and Grady. His posture changed completely now. Head low, ears forward, body rigid despite age and aching joints. The prison chaplain tightened his grip nervously on the leash. "Easy boy," he whispered. Shadow ignored him entirely. Grady cleared his throat and adjusted the cuffs of his expensive dark coat. "Maybe we should get the animal out of here," he muttered toward the warden. Death row is stressful enough without a dog losing control. Ethan stared hard at the older man. Something cold moved through his chest. 8 years earlier, Warren Grady had stood under courtroom lights and sworn Ethan murdered an undercover informant during a failed narcotics operation near the Houston Ship Channel. Grady's testimony sealed the conviction. His words had carried weight with every juror. Decorated captain, 27 years of service. Trusted, respected, untouchable. Yet now Shadow looked at him the same way he once looked at armed suspects during raids. Ethan swallowed slowly. "Shadow," he said softly. The dog's ears twitched instantly at the familiar command, but the growl remained. Ethan's voice lowered further. "What is it, partner?" Shadow suddenly lunged one step forward. The leash snapped taut in the chaplain's hands. Several guards reached instinctively toward their belts before stopping themselves. The old dog was not attacking. He was pointing, his nose locked directly onto Grady's right leg. More specifically, the lower pant cuff beneath the captain's coat. Shadow barked once now, loud enough to echo through the corridor walls. Grady stepped backward immediately. "Get him away from me." Sweat glistened faintly near his temple, now despite the cool prison air. One younger correctional officer frowned. "Sir, your pants." Everyone looked down. Along the edge of Grady's dark cuff rested a faint reddish-brown stain near the hem. Old, barely noticeable, but Shadow stared at it like fire itself. The retired captain brushed at it quickly, probably rust from outside. Yet his voice no longer sounded calm. Ethan's breathing slowed further. Memory flickered sharply behind his eyes. The night of the arrest. Rain hammering the docks. Shadow barking uncontrollably near Grady's vehicle before officers dragged Ethan away in handcuffs. At the time, Ethan thought the dog was simply panicking. But now something felt horribly wrong. The younger officer beside the warden shifted uneasily. Her name tag read Officer Leah Moreno. Mid-30s. Sharp-eyed. Quiet. She had been studying Shadow ever since the dog entered the corridor. "Captain Grady," she asked carefully, "did you work the original scene personally that night?" Grady answered too quickly. "Of course I did." Leah glanced at Shadow again. The dog had gone silent now. Somehow that silence felt worse. Shadow slowly sat down directly in front of Grady like a statue guarding a grave. Then he lifted his nose toward the captain's coat pocket and released a soft whine filled with something almost human. Recognition. Ethan's stomach tightened painfully. Because hidden inside Grady's pocket, beneath layers of fabric and years of lies, Shadow had just recognized a scent the old dog had never forgotten. The hallway smelled faintly of rainwater, old concrete, and the sharp bitterness of burned coffee drifting from the overnight guard station. Nobody moved for several long seconds. Shadow remained seated in front of Warren Grady like a silent judge beneath the prison lights, his amber eyes fixed on the older man with unnatural intensity. Officer Leah Moreno slowly stepped closer, her boots echoing softly against the concrete floor. Unlike the others, she was not watching Ethan anymore. She was watching the dog. "What exactly is in your pocket, Captain?" she asked quietly. Grady gave a dry laugh that sounded far too forced inside the still corridor. "This is ridiculous. It is an old police dog reacting to stress." Yet even as he spoke, he shifted one hand protectively toward the inside of his coat. Shadow noticed immediately. The German shepherd's ears sharpened forward again. Ethan felt cold pressure settle deep inside his chest. He remembered that movement. Grady used to guard evidence folders the exact same way during investigations years ago. Tight, defensive, careful. Leah's eyes narrowed slightly. "Sir," she said again, calmer this time, "please remove whatever is inside the pocket." The prison warden exhaled heavily beside her. "Captain, let us not make this harder than it needs to be." Rain rattled faintly somewhere against distant prison windows. Grady looked around the corridor and realized every pair of eyes had shifted toward him now. Even the guards who once respected him seemed uncertain. Slowly, reluctantly, Warren Grady reached into his coat pocket. Shadow stood immediately. The old dog did not bark this time. He simply stared. Grady pulled out a small object wrapped carefully in faded cloth. The fabric looked old, worn smooth at the corners by years of handling. Ethan's breath caught instantly the moment he saw it. A silver police K9 badge, bent slightly near one edge. Shadow released the softest whine in the world. Ethan gripped the bars harder. "That badge," he whispered. Leah looked between them carefully. "You recognize it?" Ethan nodded slowly, unable to look away. It belonged to Officer Daniel Ruiz. Silence swallowed the hallway again. Daniel Ruiz, the undercover narcotics officer whose death had sent Ethan to death row 8 years earlier. The same officer Grady claimed Ethan failed to protect during the operation at the Houston docks. Grady quickly folded the cloth back around the badge. "I kept it for the family," he muttered. But his voice no longer carried authority, only tension. Ethan's eyes darkened with memory. Daniel Ruiz had been Shadow's favorite human besides Ethan himself. Ruiz used to sneak the dog pieces of smoked brisket during overnight stakeouts. Shadow once slept beside Ruiz for 2 straight days after the officer fractured his ankle during a warehouse raid. The dog knew his scent well. Too well. Leah frowned softly. Why would Shadow react to Ruiz's badge after all this time? No one answered immediately. Then Ethan spoke quietly from inside the cell. Because Shadow was there that night. Every guard looked toward him. Ethan swallowed once before continuing. Dogs remember scent longer than people remember guilt. The words settled heavily into the corridor. Grady's jaw tightened visibly now. This is absurd, he snapped suddenly. You are seriously going to reopen a closed murder case because an old dog growled at me? Shadow took one slow step forward. Leah noticed something then. The old German shepherd was not staring at the badge anymore. He was staring lower, toward Grady's right hand. More specifically, toward the thick gold ring resting on his finger. Shadow's nose twitched sharply. Ethan's face slowly drained of color. 8 years earlier, on the night of the operation, Ethan remembered hearing Shadow bark furiously beside the loading docks moments before backup arrived. At the time, he could not understand why. But now memory returned clearer than rainwater under lightning. Daniel Ruiz had grabbed Ethan's arm seconds before collapsing and whispered only 4 words. Watch Grady's right hand. Ethan suddenly looked up at the retired captain with something close to horror. Because the gold ring on Grady's finger was no ordinary jewelry. It carried the engraved insignia of the old Gulf Task Force unit, a unit only 4 officers belonged to. One of them had secretly vanished 6 months after Ruiz died. Another retired early and moved overseas. And now, after 8 years of silence, Shadow was staring at that ring like it carried the scent of betrayal itself. The prison clock above the security gate ticked loudly now. For hours until sunrise. For hours until the state planned to carry out Ethan Cole's execution. Yet nobody in the corridor seemed focused on the clock anymore. All attention remained fixed on Shadow. The old German shepherd stood perfectly still beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, eyes locked on Warren Grady's gold ring with the quiet certainty of an animal that remembered something no human could fully explain. Leah Moreno slowly folded her arms against the cold prison air. Captain, she said carefully, where exactly were you standing when Officer Ruiz died? Grady's face hardened instantly. That testimony was given 8 years ago. I know, Leah replied softly. But I am asking again. The retired captain looked toward the warden as if expecting support, but the older man only remained silent. Outside somewhere beyond the concrete walls, thunder rolled low across the Texas sky. Rain continued falling steadily over Blackwater Penitentiary, washing silver streaks down narrow security windows. Ethan watched Shadow closely through the bars. The dog's body had not relaxed once since noticing the ring. That alone terrified him more than he wanted to admit. During their years together, Shadow had only shown that level of fixation 3 times. Each time, someone nearby turned out to be lying. Grady exhaled sharply through his nose. Ruiz died during a compromised operation, he said flatly. Cole lost control of the scene. The jury agreed. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He had repeated the truth for 8 years. Nobody listened then. The corridor lights buzzed faintly overhead. Leah stepped closer instead. Then why did the dog react to Ruiz's badge and your ring specifically? Because animals react to stress, Grady snapped. That is all this is. But Shadow suddenly moved again. Slowly, stiffly, the old German shepherd approached Grady until only inches separated them. Then, to everyone's surprise, Shadow lowered his nose directly toward the captain's right hand and inhaled deeply. The reaction was immediate. A deep growl vibrated through the dog's chest again. Stronger now. More personal somehow. Grady instinctively jerked his hand backward. The motion caused something small to slip from his coat pocket and fall onto the concrete floor with a soft metallic clink. Everyone looked down. A flash drive. Old. Scratched along the edges. Ethan's breathing stopped completely. Leah bent carefully and picked it up. What is this? She asked. Grady stepped forward immediately. Evidence from the old investigation. Then why was it hidden in your pocket instead of police archives? Leah asked quietly. No answer came. The prison corridor suddenly felt colder. Ethan stared at the flash drive through the bars as memory slowly returned piece by piece. 8 years ago, during the final days before the operation collapsed, Daniel Ruiz kept telling Ethan someone inside the department was manipulating evidence logs. Ruiz said he copied files onto a backup drive in case something happened to him. But after Ruiz died, investigators claimed the drive never existed. Ethan remembered searching desperately for it before his arrest. Shadow remembered too. The old German shepherd stared at the flash drive now and released another faint whine. Recognition. Leah looked toward the warden. Sir, I think we need to examine this immediately. Grady's composure finally cracked. You are seriously risking the integrity of a lawful execution over a dead case and an aging dog. His voice echoed sharply against the concrete walls. Shadow barked once. Loud. Commanding. Every officer flinched slightly. Ethan slowly stepped closer to the bars, eyes fixed on Grady. You know what scares you the most? He asked quietly. Grady said nothing. Ethan swallowed once. It is not the drive. The old German shepherd beside the captain stood taller despite his aching legs. Ethan's voice lowered almost to a whisper. It is the fact that Shadow still remembers the truth. For the first time that night, Warren Grady looked genuinely afraid. Not of prison, not of exposure, but of the dog standing beside him beneath the cold fluorescent lights. Because somewhere deep inside, after 8 long years, the retired captain finally understood something terrifying. Shadow had never forgotten the scent of the man who betrayed them. Leah Moreno plugged the old flash drive into the prison security computer with careful hands while thunder rolled again beyond the walls of Blackwater Penitentiary. The tiny office beside death row smelled of dust, stale paperwork, and overheated electronics. Ethan remained locked behind the bars across the corridor, unable to see the screen clearly, but he could hear every sound, every breath, every nervous shift of boots against concrete. Shadow refused to leave the doorway. The old German shepherd lay across the threshold with his head raised, eyes fixed on Warren Grady like a guard posted between truth and escape. Grady stood rigid near the back wall, arms folded tightly across his chest now. Gone was the calm confidence he carried earlier that night. Sweat darkened the collar of his expensive shirt despite the cold prison air. Leah clicked through the contents of the drive slowly. Most folders appeared corrupted by age. Broken files, damaged reports, fragments of old surveillance logs from the Houston Narcotics Division. The prison warden sighed heavily. This could take hours. Ethan lowered his eyes quietly. Hours were something he no longer had. In less than 3 hours, the state planned to move him to the execution chamber. The fluorescent lights above him buzzed faintly, washing the corridor in pale color that made everyone look tired and haunted. Then suddenly Leah stopped moving. Wait. Her voice came barely above a whisper. Everyone looked toward the monitor. A single video file had opened successfully. No title, no timestamp, just grainy dock surveillance footage flickering across the screen. Ethan's pulse slammed hard against his ribs. Rain streaked across the old video footage exactly the same way it fell tonight. The Houston shipping docks appeared dim beneath yellow floodlights. Cargo containers lined narrow lanes like silent walls. Then figures entered the frame. Ethan recognized himself instantly beside Shadow near the loading area. Younger, stronger, wearing his old K9 tactical vest. Shadow stirred softly from the doorway, as if recognizing the memory too. The video continued. Daniel Ruiz appeared moments later near the far side of the dock, speaking urgently into a radio. Then another figure stepped into view from the shadows behind him. Warren Grady. The office fell completely silent. Ethan stared through the bars without breathing. In the footage, Ruiz handed Grady something small. Evidence. Even through the grainy image, Ethan recognized the shape immediately. The same flash drive now sitting beside the keyboard. Grady glanced around nervously before slipping the drive into his coat pocket. Then Ruiz grabbed the captain's arm sharply, appearing angry. Desperate. The footage had no audio, but emotion alone told the story. Ethan's stomach tightened painfully. He remembered this moment. It happened only minutes before backup arrived, and the entire operation collapsed into chaos. On screen, Ruiz pointed toward Ethan and Shadow repeatedly, as if trying to explain something important. Then Grady suddenly shoved Ruiz backward and walked out of frame. The office computer crackled softly. Leah paused the footage. "My God," she whispered. The prison warden slowly removed his glasses. Warren Grady stepped forward immediately. That footage proves nothing. But nobody looked at him anymore. Ethan's hands trembled against the bars. Because for the first time in 8 years, someone besides him had finally seen the truth with their own eyes. Shadow slowly rose from the doorway and walked toward the monitor. The old German shepherd stared at the frozen image of Daniel Ruiz on the screen for several long seconds. Then, gently, almost heartbreakingly, Shadow pressed his nose against the image of the fallen officer. A soft whine escaped him. Ethan closed his eyes instantly. Some wounds did not fade with time. Some loyalty did not die even after death itself. Leah swallowed hard before reaching for the keyboard again. "There is more footage after this," she said quietly. Grady's face lost what little color remained. Outside, lightning flashed white across the narrow prison windows. And somewhere deep inside Blackwater Penitentiary, hope finally flickered back to life. Leah Moreno pressed play again with trembling fingers while rain whispered endlessly against the prison windows. The grainy dock footage resumed beneath the dim glow of the security monitor, flickering shadows across the faces gathered inside the small office near death row. Ethan stood motionless behind the bars across the corridor, his hands gripping cold steel so tightly the scars along his knuckles had turned pale. Shadow remained beside the computer now, old eyes fixed on the screen as though the dog understood every second mattered. The footage jumped briefly with static before stabilizing again. Daniel Ruiz appeared back inside frame, pacing anxiously near the cargo containers while speaking rapidly into his radio. Then the camera angle shifted slightly as another vehicle pulled onto the dock. A black unmarked police SUV. Ethan's pulse slowed dangerously inside his chest. He remembered that vehicle. Grady always drove it during narcotics operations. On screen, the captain stepped toward the SUV and opened the rear passenger door. Another man emerged. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a Gulf Task Force jacket. Leah leaned closer to the screen. Who was that? Ethan stared hard through the bars before recognition finally struck him like ice water. Marcus Vane. Silence swallowed the office again. Warren Grady shut his eyes briefly. Marcus Vane had once been one of the department's top narcotics detectives before disappearing 6 months after Ruiz died. Official reports claimed he retired early due to psychological stress. Nobody had seen him publicly since. Yet there he was standing clearly on the footage from 8 years ago beneath the dock floodlights. Leah's breathing quickened. That means Grady lied during testimony. Ethan nodded slowly. He said Vane was never at the scene. On the monitor, Ruiz suddenly pointed angrily toward Ethan's patrol unit parked farther down the dock. Marcus Vane shook his head sharply. Then something happened that made the room go completely still. Shadow began barking violently at the screen. Loud. Desperate. The old German shepherd pressed toward the monitor with surprising strength despite his age, claws scraping across the floor as he growled directly at Marcus Vane's image. Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. "Pause it," he said suddenly. Leah froze the frame instantly. Ethan stepped closer to the bars, eyes locked on the image. Zoom in near the loading bay. Leah enlarged the grainy footage carefully. The image blurred for a second before sharpening just enough to reveal something hidden near the edge of the dock. Another figure, barely visible behind stacked cargo crates. Ethan's heart nearly stopped. Daniel was recording them, he whispered. The hidden angle suddenly made sense. Ruiz knew something was wrong before backup arrived. He had secretly positioned an additional camera to capture the meeting. Leah resumed playback slowly. On screen, Ruiz reached toward Grady again as though demanding the flash drive back. Marcus Vane stepped between them. Then all 3 men disappeared briefly behind the cargo containers outside the camera's direct view. Seconds later, Shadow in the footage suddenly lunged hard against his leash near Ethan's patrol vehicle, barking uncontrollably toward the containers. Ethan remembered that exact moment now. Officers had accused the dog of becoming aggressive after the operation failed. But Shadow had not been acting wild. He had been warning them. The office computer crackled softly as the footage continued. Then came the moment that changed everything. Marcus Vane reappeared alone, carrying Ruiz's badge in one hand. Grady emerged seconds later looking shaken. But Daniel Ruiz never returned to frame. Leah covered her mouth quietly. The prison warden lowered his head in disbelief. Ethan felt his knees weaken beneath him. 8 years. 8 years buried under lies while the truth sat hidden inside a forgotten drive protected only by an old dog who refused to forget. Then the footage ended abruptly in static. Nobody spoke for several long seconds. Finally, Leah turned slowly toward Warren Grady. "You knew," she whispered. Grady looked exhausted suddenly. Older, smaller somehow. But before he could answer, Shadow let out a low warning growl toward the hallway outside the office. Heavy footsteps echoed rapidly down the corridor. More officers approaching. Then a voice crackled urgently over the prison radio. "Execution prep begins in 30 minutes. Ethan closed his eyes briefly as thunder rolled across the Texas sky once more. Because even with the truth finally surfacing, time was still running out. The announcement echoed through Blackwater Penitentiary with cold mechanical indifference. "Execution protocol begins in 20 minutes. The words rolled down the corridor like a funeral bell. Guards shifted uneasily beneath the fluorescent lights while rain continued tapping softly against the narrow prison windows. Somewhere far beyond the concrete walls, dawn was slowly approaching Texas. Ethan stood silently behind the bars, staring at the grainy frozen image still glowing on the computer monitor. Marcus Vane, Warren Grady, Daniel Ruiz. The truth had finally surfaced after 8 years buried beneath fear and silence. Yet the state's clock continued moving forward as though none of it mattered. Leah Moreno grabbed the prison office phone immediately. "Give me the district attorney's emergency line," she demanded. Her voice shook now, not from fear, but urgency. The prison warden stepped beside her. "We need an immediate stay of execution." Behind them, Warren Grady slowly lowered himself into a metal chair. He suddenly looked exhausted beneath the harsh white lights. Older than Ethan remembered. The retired captain rubbed trembling hands across his face while Shadow remained standing several feet away, watching him with unwavering eyes. Ethan noticed something then. Grady was no longer angry. He was defeated. The old German shepherd had finally cornered a truth no courtroom ever could. Leah spoke rapidly into the phone, explaining the footage, the hidden drive, the contradictions in testimony. Her words blurred together beneath the buzzing lights and distant thunder outside. Ethan barely heard them anymore. His attention rested entirely on Shadow. The dog's breathing had become heavier over the past hour. Age was catching up now that adrenaline had faded. His back legs trembled slightly whenever he stood too long. Yet still he refused to leave Ethan's side. Ethan knelt slowly beside the bars again. "You kept fighting for me," he whispered softly. Shadow turned instantly toward his voice and stepped closer. The old German shepherd pressed his muzzle gently between the cold steel bars until Ethan's scarred hands found his fur again. Warm, familiar, real. Ethan lowered his forehead against Shadow's head and closed his eyes. For a moment, the prison disappeared completely. No death row, no execution chamber, no lies. Only a Marine and the dog who never abandoned him. Then Leah suddenly gasped behind them. "Wait, there is another file." Everyone looked toward the computer. Hidden beneath the corrupted folders sat one final audio recording. Timestamp, 11 minutes after the doc footage ended. Leah clicked play. Static crackled through the tiny speakers first. Rain. Footsteps. Heavy breathing. Then Daniel Ruiz's voice emerged weakly through the distortion. "If anybody finds this, Ethan Cole did not betray us." Ethan's entire body froze. Even Grady looked up sharply. Ruiz continued speaking through broken static. "Grady and Vane were moving narcotics through seized evidence shipments. I copied everything." A long cough interrupted the recording. Then came the words that shattered the room completely. "Shadow tried warning us before it happened. Trust the dog. He knows." Silence followed. No one breathed. No one moved. Even the rain outside seemed to stop for one impossible second. Ethan slowly covered his mouth with trembling hands as tears finally escaped freely down his face. 8 years. 8 years hearing the world call him a murderer, while the truth sat hidden inside a forgotten recording protected only by loyalty and instinct. The prison radio suddenly crackled again. "Warden, status update on inmate Cole." The older man grabbed the radio immediately, voice firm now. "Suspend all execution procedures immediately. This is an official order." Ethan looked up sharply. Leah turned toward him, eyes shining with disbelief. "You are not dying today." The words barely felt real inside the cold prison corridor. Shadow let out the softest whine in the world and leaned heavily against the bars as though some invisible weight had finally lifted from his aging body. Warren Grady lowered his head completely into his hands. Outside, The first faint gray light of morning began touching the storm clouds beyond Blackwater Penitentiary. And for the first time in nearly a decade, Ethan Cole felt something return to his chest that he thought prison had buried forever. Hope. Morning arrived slowly over Blackwater Penitentiary. The storm had finally passed, leaving the prison yard washed clean beneath pale Texas sunlight. Water dripped steadily from razor-wire fences and rusted guard towers while cold wind carried the scent of wet earth through the open security gates. For the first time in 8 years, Ethan Cole walked through those gates without chains around his wrists. He moved slowly at first, almost like a man afraid freedom itself might disappear if he stepped too fast. The gray prison-issued jacket hung loose across his broad shoulders, and exhaustion lined every inch of his face. But his eyes no longer carried the hollow stillness of death row. Beside him walked Shadow. The old German shepherd limped slightly now, his joints stiff after the long night. Yet he stayed close enough that his shoulder brushed Ethan's leg every few steps. Neither of them seemed willing to let the other drift too far away again. Reporters had gathered beyond the outer fence after news spread about the suspended execution and reopened investigation. But the prison warden quietly led Ethan and Shadow through a side exit away from the cameras. No flashing lights, no speeches, just silence and sunrise. Leah Moreno waited beside an old pickup truck near the gravel road leading away from the prison grounds. Steam curled softly from 2 paper cups of coffee resting on the hood. When Ethan approached, she handed him one without speaking. The warmth spread instantly through his cold hands. Marcus Vane was arrested 2 hours ago near El Paso, Leah finally said softly. Grady confessed after the recording played. Ethan stared down into the coffee for a long moment. 8 lost years reduced to 1 sentence. The wind rustled quietly through the dry grass surrounding the prison road. Shadow slowly lowered himself onto the ground beside Ethan's boots with a tired groan. Leah smiled faintly as she watched the dog. He never stopped waiting for you, she whispered. Ethan swallowed hard. Where was he all this time? Leah glanced toward the horizon where early sunlight painted the clouds gold. After your arrest, Shadow was transferred to a K-9 retirement kennel outside Houston. But every single morning for 8 years, he sat beside the gate waiting whenever transport buses arrived. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Leah continued softly. The handlers said he stopped eating for days whenever execution appeals were denied. Last month he got sick. Arthritis. Heart problems. They thought he was giving up. Ethan knelt slowly beside the old German shepherd and buried trembling fingers into the thick sable fur around his neck. Shadow immediately leaned against him with a long, exhausted sigh. Safe now. Finally safe. Ethan noticed something then hanging beneath the worn leather collar. Daniel Ruiz's silver K-9 badge, bent at one corner, carefully polished despite age. Leah smiled gently. The kennel director said Shadow guarded that badge every night. Nobody could take it from him. Ethan stared at the small silver badge glinting softly in the morning light. Then his composure finally broke completely. Tears slid silently down his weathered face as he wrapped both arms around the old dog who had crossed nearly a decade of loneliness just to bring him home again. Shadow closed his cloudy eyes and rested his head against Ethan's chest exactly the same way he used to after long patrol shifts years ago. Around them, the world stayed quiet. No sirens, no prison doors, no courtroom lies, just sunlight warming the wet gravel road and the steady breathing of 2 survivors who had carried each other through the darkest years imaginable. Ethan lowered his forehead gently against Shadow's and whispered the words the old dog had waited almost a decade to hear. Good boy, partner. You saved me.